One of the scariest circumstances you can imagine is being on death row, knowing you're about to die, but you didn't do the crime. These 5 men didn't do the crime, but they did do the time. Luckily, their lives were spared. A lot of times, especially before DNA analysis was what it was today and was admissible in court, oftentimes a murder investigation would fall on an eyewitness. We now know in the year 2024, as of recording this, that eyewitnesses oftentimes aren't the best source of "he done it." But back in the 70s and 80s, you could have a clear-cut case based on one eyewitness. Kirk Bloodsworth is one of those stories. In 1985, Kirk Bloodsworth, who was a former Marine, was convicted of a brutal assault and murder of a 9-year-old girl named Dawn Hamilton in Rosedale, Maryland. The case against him was largely based on an eyewitness's testimony, which ultimately led to his conviction and sentenced him to death. Bloodsworth was adamant that he was innocent. He never for 1 minute wavered, but he was convicted because 5 witnesses claimed to have seen him with the victim. It was an open and shut case, and he was sentenced to death and spent almost 9 years in prison. 2 of those years were on death row. This man, who had never met this girl before, who was accused of doing terrible things and then ultimately murdering her, was on death row, and he knew that there was somebody else out there who got away with it. And he was gonna have his own life sacrificed for somebody else's terrible deed. Now keep in mind, during this time, DNA analysis wasn't like it is today. A lot of the times, DNA analysis wasn't even allowed in a courtroom. In 1992, after much persistence from Bloodsworth's team, his defense successfully lobbied for a DNA testing to be put in as evidence, which was a relatively new technology at the time, and the DNA results conclusively proved that Bloodsworth had nothing to do with the crime. This was in 1992. It still took some time for him to go home. This is part that baffles me. Everybody knows they're innocent. It is without a shadow of a doubt they're innocent, but they still have to sit there so paperwork can be done. And in this case, in 1993, Bloodsworth was finally released from prison. Bloodsworth did leave a lasting legacy. The passing of the Innocence Protection Act in 2004, which includes the provision for better access to post-conviction DNA testing. Luckily, he was only in jail for 7 years, which seems like a long time, but that's nothing compared to our next entry. Anthony Ray Hinton fought for his life for years behind bars. In 1985, Hinton, who was an African-American man from Alabama, was arrested and charged with 2 murders that took place during separate armed robberies at fast food restaurants. Despite maintaining his innocence and having a solid alibi, Hinton was convicted and then sentenced to death. Another piece of evidence that oftentimes was used to convict killers during that time before DNA was ballistics. Now, ballistics is a really great way to show which bullet came out of which gun. Every gun leaves a fingerprint, basically, on a bullet. However, you need a ballistics expert to show up to court who's actually a ballistics expert. In this case, was based primarily on ballistics evidence. Police claim that the bullets from the crime scenes match the revolver owned by Hinton's mother. And Hinton's defense attorney, who had little experience in capital cases, did not hire a competent ballistics expert. And because of this, the testimony of the state was basically unchallenged. Plus, Hinton was relatively poor. He grew up in a poor neighborhood, he was poor himself, and couldn't afford a good lawyer. So the state's attorney just buried his appointed attorney. And for decades and decades, Hinton fought to prove his innocence. And finally, in 1999, the Equal Justice Initiative, led by attorney Brian Stevenson, took up the case. And they argued that Hinton's conviction was based on faulty forensics and that the ballistics evidence used to convict him was fundamentally flawed. And after a competent ballistics experts looked at the bullet and the gun, they decided this bullet never came from that gun in the first place. And despite the overwhelming evidence, it took years for the courts to grant him a new trial. And finally, in 2014, the US Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Hinton had received ineffective counsel during his trial and that his constitutional rights had been violated, and his conviction was overturned. Yet again, more paperwork to be done, and it wasn't until 2015 Hinton was finally released. The crazy thing about these cases is this man was never apologized to by anybody who prosecuted him, including the judge, and he received no money for his troubles. He spent nearly 30 years in jail on death row, and still no money at all. As if 30 years weren't stolen from him, he was just let go back into society, a completely new world, and best of luck getting a job. Best of luck fitting into society. Luckily, Hinton made a name for himself, wrote a book, and he's doing just fine. Well, as fine as you can be after having 30 years of your life stolen. 30 years is a long time, and clearly there's no cases where someone spent more time than that looking guilty when they were really innocent. Well, there was a man who served 39 years before he was released. Ricky Jackson is a former wrongfully convicted man who spent 39 years in prison, making his case the longest wrongful imprisonment in the US history. In 1975, Ricky Jackson and two brothers, Wiley and Ronnie Brigjamin, were convicted of the murder of Harold Franks, a businessman in Cleveland, Ohio, and Franks was killed during a robbery in broad daylight. So Jackson, along with the Bridgman brothers, they were accused of committing the crime. This is crazy. I promise you it's real. Look it up for yourself. The entire case was based on one eyewitness, and that eyewitness wasn't a lawyer or a doctor or some outstanding citizen, the mayor. It was a 12-year-old boy who was coerced into giving a statement. So imagine being this 12-year-old boy. You know that you lied. You know you perjured yourself. But you can't do anything about it because now you're going to be in trouble. But the only reason you lied is because the police made you feel like you were doing something wrong if you didn't. So now there's a man in jail for nearly 40 years and a 12-year-old growing up to be a man who has the most guilty conscience, and it feels like there's nothing he can do about it. That boy was named Edward Vernon, and he claimed to have witnessed the murder. Vernon's testimony became the key evidence in the trial and led to the conviction of Jackson and the Bridgman brothers. Jackson was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later reduced to life in prison after Ohio temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1978. But the case was problematic from the very start. There was zero physical evidence linking Jackson or the Bridgman brothers to the crime, and Vernon's testimony, which he later admitted was coerced by police, was the only evidence used to convict them. Now, obviously, the Bridgman brothers and Jackson maintained their innocence the entire time, unwavered. But the legal system repeatedly failed to correct the injustice, and in 2011, Edward Vernon came forward and recanted his testimony. He admitted that he never saw the murder, and he had been pressured by Cleveland police to accuse Jackson and the Bridgmans, and with the support of Ohio Innocence Project, new efforts were made to prove Jackson's innocence. But if a witness comes forward and says, I actually didn't see what I said that I saw, and the entire case was based on that guy saying he saw what he saw when he didn't see it, shouldn't that person just go home automatically? And it took Vernon to recant his statement for the courts to finally agree to hear new evidence. This was in 2011, and it took until 2014 for all the charges against Jackson and Bridgman brothers to be dismissed. And on November 21st, 2014, after 39 years behind bars for crimes they did not commit, Ricky Jackson and the brothers were released from prison. Ohio did eventually pay Jackson $1 million for his troubles, but if you really think about it, $1 million over 40 years? That's a poverty wage over those 40 years. We're talking just north of $25,000 a year to be in prison. Nobody would take that deal. What's worse than grown men going to jail when they're innocent is teenagers. And everyone's heard of the Central Park 5, but have you heard about the West Memphis 3? The West Memphis 3 refers to three teenagers, Damien, Jason, and Jesse, who were wrongfully convicted for the 1993 murders of three 8-year-old boys. This happened in West Memphis, Arkansas, and their case became highly controversial due to the lack of evidence, allegations of police misconduct, and the role of public hysteria in their convictions. On May 5th, 1993, the three boys were reported missing, and their bodies were found the next day in a wooded area. They had been murdered, and the nature of their killings led police to speculate about satanic rituals, and this fueled public outrage and hysteria. Also, this created a rush to find the suspects. Back in 1993, there was this whole hoopla. I mean, this was much after the Manson thing, but still, there was hoopla over if there was some sort of satanic ritual. We need to find these people immediately. Damien, Jason, and Jesse, who were all teenagers at the time, were arrested and they were charged with the murders. Now, the idea that it was a satanic killing, this is what put them behind bars in the first place. Damien was a teen who had a reputation for being interested in the occult, and he had been seen as kind of an outsider in the community. Jesse was intellectually disabled and had a very low IQ, and he was the one that was interrogated by the police first for 12 hours without a lawyer or his parents present. So he eventually confessed to the crime. But the confession was very inconsistent and filled with factual inaccuracies. Basically, it was somebody confessing to something that he didn't do, so all of the details that he gave weren't correct. which usually would mean he didn't do it, but the police wanted to make an arrest, and that's all that mattered to them. Jesse was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 40 years. Jason was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. And Damien, who is considered the ringleader due to his interest in the occult, was sentenced to death. This is a teenager who was sentenced to death for something they had no evidence that he did. This was a highly public trial with little physical evidence linking the teenagers to the crime, and the prosecution's case relied on the coerced confession. Also, dubious witness testimony and the satanic panic sweeping the nation at the time. And as the years went on, significant doubts arose about the fairness of the trial and the validity of the evidence that was used to convict the West Memphis Three. And there were several documentaries, one in 1996 called Paradise Lost, and its sequel that drew national and international attention to the case. And in the years that followed, forensic experts criticized the case, and the new DNA testing failed to link any of the 3 to the crime. In fact, all the evidence that was found DNA-wise was linking somebody else with a criminal record, who was never investigated for the case in the first place. And after many legal battle over the course of many years, in 2011, the West Memphis Three entered into an unusual legal agreement known as Alford plea. Alford plea allowed them to plead guilty while still asserting their innocence. Under this plea, they acknowledged that the state had enough evidence to convict them, but maintained their claim that they did not commit the crime. So, on August 19th, 2011, after 18 years in prison, Damien, Jason, and Jesse were released from prison. Now, all's good, right? They got out, they're fine? Well, no, because they're all convicted murderers. Because of Alford plea, that means that they still have that on their record, which means they're felons for the rest of history. Obviously, the next one on the list you'd think is the Central Park 5, but I think we'll save that for an episode on its own. If you want to see that, let me know in the comment section below. As always, please hit the like and subscribe, and because I do videos like this every weekend, I'll see you in the next one.